Today we're going to look at how to remove and install mechanism springs. Now, mechanism springs, as well as these reclining mechanisms, can cause injury, so any work you do on these is at your own risk. When removing or attaching these springs, there are 3 things that you should always do without fail. Number 1, always use the correct tool or tools. Number 2, always be in full control of the spring, whether you're attaching or removing it. And number 3, always wear eye protection. Now, I made my mistakes years ago and learned these lessons the hard way. I was out on a call and I was going to attach a spring and I'd forgotten my tool and left it back at the furniture store. So I decided I'd improvise and use a pair of pliers instead. So I violated 2 of the rules. I didn't have the proper tool and I was not in full control of the spring. As a result, the spring popped off and ended up embedding itself in the palm of my hand, sticking straight up. I looked at it and I thought, well, this is not good, but at least the customer didn't freak out and I wasn't spraying blood all over the place. But again, always use the right tool and always be in full control of the spring. All right, let's take a look at what the proper tool looks like. Well, I don't have one. I'll show you what I use in a second, but I can show you how to make one. You start with a piece of solid steel stock and you attach a metal stem so that you can grab it. And this T-handle is like a mini or small version of a meat hook, if you will. So the hook on the end of this should be a half circle, needs to be small enough yet strong enough so that you can reach into tight places inside the mechanism to hook onto those springs. And the T-handle shape and design will give you plenty of pulling power. Here's what I use, a piece of heavy twine. I use this to remove and attach back springs, seat springs, and mechanism springs. So you thread one end through the spring, the other end you wrap around your hand to get a good grip, and that gives you plenty of pulling power. Now, let's say that you have a spring that's fallen off, perhaps broken, and you have a replacement and you want to replace it, but you can't determine where to attach the spring. Some mechanisms have symmetrical setups for their mechanism springs. So if that's the case, simply refer to the other scissor to see where to attach that spring. Or if you're reattaching a spring on a reclining love seat, sofa, matching recliners, or matching sectional recliners, you can always refer to the other units to see where that spring belongs. But let's say you don't have any of those advantages and your unit is not symmetrical. Well, you only have 2 options left. 1, contact the manufacturer and see if they have a sketch that shows the mechanism and specifically a close-up of where the springs attach. And if you can't get that, there's only 1 option left, and that is to look for those spring attachment points that I mentioned earlier and look for areas where a little bit of that black paint has chipped off or worn off at those attachment points, because that's a clue that that's where the spring attached. Once you find one of those, and then you know how long the spring is, that'll give you a clue as to where the other attachment point is. It's kind of a long shot, but I've actually done that myself a couple of times, and it does work if you have the time and patience. Some mech springs will attach one end to the mechanism and the other end to the seat frame, and that could be the bottom of the seat frame rail, inside, or the back rail. So when that's the case, look for like a little eyelet or something that's screwed into the wood frame there as an attachment point for the spring. So let's say you're missing a spring, you need a replacement. It's always best to go with a manufacturer replacement if you can get that. If not, check with the dealer or a local repair tech to see if they have something that matches close enough to work on your chair. Be sure to bring them the broken pieces of your old spring, if you have that, so they can try to match up the spring style and length. Okay, let's go ahead and remove some of these springs. Before we remove any springs, you want to determine in which position is it stretched the least. Normally, that's when the scissors are open. And as you can see, it appears to be pretty relaxed, but let's check that. Let's close them. And indeed, you can see the coils are separating here. The spring is more attached, has more tension. So we want to open it, and this is the position we want to remove the spring. So when removing a spring, always find the position where it's stretched the least to remove or install. Okay, let's start with this spring. As you can see, whenever there are slots or attachment points right beside where the spring is attached, that's sometimes an option. But if the chair is working well, I don't recommend moving the spring. Leave it where it is. So let's remove this one. I'm going to wrap the other end of the cord around my hand to get a good grip. And there we are. It's always a good idea to plan ahead as to which way you want to stretch the spring and how you want to attach it. And the most difficult end should always be attached first. Here there's an attachment point that two springs share, and there's very little room. So I'm going to attach it there first. Get it hooked in there. Hold some tension on it. Reattach my spring, get a good grip. And then as I move it up, I'm going to push it in with my finger if I need to adjust it to get it reinstalled. Let's do this one next. I'm going to loop my twine around this end. Wrap my hand. Embrace the chair a little bit. And there we are. Now I'm going to put it back on a little bit differently. Since this is a difficult end to get this little hook in, it's kind of crowded here. I'm going to reattach it this way. Again, make sure you have tension on the end of the spring so it's firmly attached. Now this one here, you can see the hook is sideways, so I need to turn this over so that it hooks in easier. And sometimes you'll need to use another tool like long needle nose pliers or something to adjust this. Make sure it's still attached. And when I tighten it, I'm just going to push down on the twine. Now if your twine gets caught, you can always cut it off and leave it. That can fall out later. On this spring we have a little bump out here. So we're going to hook it near the top. And stretch it up. And this one, reinstallation is a no-brainer because obviously stretching down to this point would be very difficult. So simply hook it there first and attach the other end. So you can install and remove many mechanism springs by pulling them to stretch them, but there will be exceptions to that rule that you may encounter. One example is the La-Z-Boy reclining mechanism. I've never been able to find a good way to remove those springs by pulling them, so I had to come up with a different method. I use heavy-duty vice grips to lock firmly onto the spring to maintain full control. I install the end of the spring into the toggle. That's the C-shaped metal part that attaches to the drive rod. Then I lock the vice grips firmly onto the spring to stretch it by pushing the opposite end onto the round support shaft toward the front of the chair. To remove the spring, simply reverse these steps. So if you come across a spring that you can't remove or install the conventional way, take some time to consider alternative methods that will keep you safe. And remember those 3 rules. Use the proper tool, always maintain full control of the spring, and be sure to wear eye protection.